Okay, this is on, objective here is to get you to understand kind of how wattages are calculated and what wattages come from. The video you're about to watch in a minute is using an online power supply calculator, which you're going to watch, and we're going to go over it when I come back next class. But I kind of want to show you how things work out. Watts, again, is our volts, which is the volts is defined, right? It's the plug that it's connected to. So in most cases, that's a 12-volt plug. Times amperage, which we don't know, it depends on the component, equals watts, which is the total power that that item uses, okay? And we talked about, or I mentioned that power supplies are defined by their wattage, and how many watts a power supply can push out to its components is how good of a power supply it is, or at least it's one of the ways that a power supply is rated. So we don't know the amperage of all those things that are plugged in, but there are different ways that tables have been made and online calculators have been set up that help us to figure out what wattage we need for a specific computer. This chart is an example of a chart that you might find somewhere that says how much wattage typical components use. And so when you're figuring out wattage of the power supply, you would total together all the things and all the components that are in your computer to figure out how many watts you need for your power supply. Now, every single computer has a motherboard. In this table, it's saying a typical motherboard uses 50 watts. Now, that's a static term, and it depends on what motherboard you have. It's a guess. And that's why tables aren't the greatest in the world, but they do usually come up to very close to the online calculator you're going to watch the video. So everyone's got a motherboard. And then what kind of CPU does it have? How many cores does a CPU have? In other words, how many brains does that CPU have? It helps determine how much amperage it pulls and therefore how much wattage it requires. And you can see that the more cores, the more wattage. All of our PCs here at Trail are single core PCs except for some of the servers. So I'm going to circle 50. Okay, so I'm going to say a typical PC here at school uses 50 watts for the CPU. Then what kind of video card does it have? So I'm just walking my way down this table. What kind of video card does it have? Does it have a basic or integrated video card? Then it's going to use 30 watts. If it's got a really high-end gamer card, maybe it uses as many as 120, and really good gamer systems might have 2 cards, so you might have to have 2. So we're going to say we're doing this for, by the way, a traditional or a typical National Trail PC. So video card, we're going to circle that and say that's what we're going to use. And you're going to do problems just like this on your test. I'm going to give you a web page to go to on a computer, and I'm going to say, tell me what wattage I'm looking for, and I'm going to define that as well. So memory then is per stick. Does it have 1 stick of memory? Does it have 2? The one next to me, the black one that's up here by the whiteboard, has 4 sticks in it. So I'm going to put a 4 times there. That's how much memory it's got. And that's optical drive. That's CD-ROM. That's CD-ROMs or DVDs or Blu-rays. That one has 1. So we're going to just circle the 30 and say it's got 1. It could have 2. Hard drives, 25 watts for a hard drive. I can't tell from looking at it, but I know it's got 2, so I'm going to put a 2 times that there. Floppy drives, yeah, that one's got a floppy drive. Normally they only have 1 if they have 1. Other expansion cards. Okay, now those integrated things are all included on the motherboard, but I have to look at the back of a PC to know if it's got expansion cards in it. Yeah, it's got 1. It's got an extra network card, so I'm going to circle 1 there. Okay, it's got an extra network card. Now USB. USB is per device, how much wattage each one pulls. I don't think it matters how many are plugged in because you want to know, will it be able to hold them all? So I'm going to count, even though there's none plugged into this, actually there's a keyboard, I'm going to count how many ports. So I've got 8 ports, 8 USB ports. So I'm going to put an 8 times there. because that's the max that it's going to pull. And then does it have any extra cooling fans that are blowing out the back? Certainly does. It's got one extra cooling fan, so it's got one extra. So now I'm going to total this all together. So I've got 50 and 50 and 30 and 4 times 15, that's 60, and 30, and 2 times 25, that's 50, and 5 and 5, I'm just going to write 10 there and put those together. 8 times 3 is 24, and we've got one extra cooling fan, that's 3. Let's do some addition here. So we've got 100 up here, we've got 120 down here. I'm just kind of crossing off as we go. I got another 60, 87 together, so let's do some math. 313. So I've got 313 watts right now, minimum. Okay, that's minimum. Or I'm going to say calculated, because I want to get some terms straight for you here. Because there's some terms I'm going to ask you for in the test when we do these problems. Okay, so I've calculated 313, and here's some terms that I want you to know. So I've got calculated minimum recommended. Okay? Calculated in this case is 313. I want you to round up to the next 50 or 100, or the next 50 interval, to figure out your minimum, which, if I round that up, I go to 350. And recommended, you're going to add 50 more. Okay? So, if I gave you this exact problem on your test, and I ask you what's the calculated wattage required for this configuration, the answer would be 313. If I said, what is the minimum wattage, because they don't come in 313s. There's no such thing as a 313 watt power supply. They're usually in 50s, some of them go 20s, but we're going to say 50s. Okay, because when you look at buying them, you'll see they're usually in 50 watt increments. So the minimum, when I get that one, is going to be 350. Okay, that's the minimum that you're really going to find that's going to fit that PC. Is 350 watt power supply. And then I'm going to add 50 more to say recommended. So if I said, what is the recommended power supply for this? You would say 400 watts. Okay, 400 watts. So there's calculated, which is what you get off of the website or what you get out of the paper by doing it by hand. You round up to the next 50 to get the minimum, because that's what you're really going to find. You're not going to find a 313. You're going to find a 350. And then you're going to add 50 on top of that for what I'm calling the recommended power supply. These are my recommendations, but that's what I'm testing you on. And why do I add 50? I add 50 because if you add anything else to this PC, you do not want to have to add a new power supply. Okay, when we look back at this chart, there are some things there that I could easily have said, well, you know, I'm going to upgrade that later. I don't have the money to do it right now, but I can upgrade it later. If I go and switch, for instance, video cards, it's a 90 watt difference right there. Right there. And if I knew I was going to buy a video card, then even my recommended isn't going to cover it, is it? If I add 90 to this, I'm over 400 watts, aren't I? So that doesn't even cover that. But it does cover normal stuff. If I want to add a new optical drive to it, I want to add a DVD burner on top of having my DVD, I want to add a couple more sticks of RAM, I want to add an additional hard drive, I have a little flexibility by adding that 50 that recommended. Okay, I have a little bit of flexibility. I don't have time. So definitions that I want you to go with, I want you to understand, is when you calculate the wattage, that's the calculated number. The minimum is rounded up to the next 50. Up, always rounding up. You don't round down to 310. Round up to 350. Okay, and then the recommended would be 50 on top of that. So if we got to calculate it, equals 293. Our minimum would be 300. and our recommended would be 350. I'm going to ask you problems just like that. In fact, in some cases, I'm going to go and give you the answer. I'm going to say, hey, I calculated a wattage of 293. What would be your recommendation on my power supply? What wattage would be your recommendation? And you would say 350 or more. Okay? I really want at least 350. I need 300 min just to power what I got right now. And I want to add another 50. And power supplies don't use more electricity because they have a higher wattage rating. In fact, they're generally more efficient and cooler if they're farther away from their maximum from what they're pulling. Okay, and we're going to read about that here in just a minute. You're going to read some power supply myths and some other stuff here later on today. So, why don't you make sure you know those terms. We've got calculated minimum is rounded up to the next 50 or 100, depending on what the next rounding is, okay? And recommended is minimum plus 50, okay? When I ask you what would be your recommended, it'd be 350 really or more. If you could get a 700 watt power supply, it's not going to hurt you. Just going to give you a little bit of flexibility, okay? So I'm going to give you charts like this right here to do some problems with. And I'm going to give you a link to a website. Say, here's a PC. What would you say is the recommended power supply wattage or the minimum power supply wattage? Okay? I usually don't ask calculated. It's implied that you figured it out relatively close to get it to recommended or minimums, right? Because you're just rounding up from there. Okay, so they all have motherboards, right? They all have a CPU. In this case, there's 4 different choices here. They've all got video, whether it's integrated, basic, or a gamer card, okay? They've all got memory. You got to figure out how many sticks there are. Figure that out because they all pull. They've got all normally have an optical drive. How many do they have? Hard drives, how many do they have? Floppy drives, other expansion cards. Those could be NICs, modems, extra sound cards, extra USB cards, and then USB. And this calculator says per device. That's really talking about per device that's plugged in. Again, I'm going to say per port because you don't want to calculate it for, oh, I'm going to buy one because I only have a USB mouse right now. And then later on you add a mic, a Vimeo, a camera, and you keep adding things. Mine is tapped out. I have every single USB port in my computer tapped out. So obviously I wouldn't want that to go down. And then extra cooling fans, if there's anything other than the CPU fan on there. Any other fan other than that, and we don't include the power supply fan either because it already figures out into its own wattage, okay? And then you just add those things together and you come up with calculated, round up to minimum, plus 50 for recommended, okay? Now, the next video you're going to watch is an example of somebody else going through an online power supply calculator that we do use in this class, and you'll answer some questions doing that as well. If you go down here to our power supply calculators and you click on this power supply calculator, Outer Vision Extreme, that is what this next YouTube video is going to be going through. He's going to show you how to use that website to calculate the power requirement of your PC. That is a much more accurate way than doing the table, okay? There's also, if you have time and want to practice, we're going to do this in class as well. Here's some links to PCs, as well as underneath that a worksheet showing the example power supply sheet here. This is exactly the one I just showed you, and going through and calculating some of those. We're actually going to do that next class, but feel free to go and play with that if you want to as well, because I'm going to make sure you understand how to do that and how to pick out a power supply. And next class I'm also going to be modeling that power supply presentation, but that's really after you understand them pretty well. So that's it for my introduction to power supply wattages. After you watch his video, you're going to watch, I'm going to have a link to a couple additional readings for you as well.